Welcome to Lecture 25 of Biology 115, entitled Community Ecology. In our previous lecture and our first look at ecology as a whole, we looked at the level of ecology specifically focusing on the population. We're going to zoom out our scope now and look at the community level. And before we do that, we have to, of course, establish a good working idea of what it means to study community ecology. And we can do that by introducing a very simple introductory flowchart. And we'll entitle that first flowchart Introduction. So in this flowchart, we'll get some basic definitions down and some basic ideas about what it means to study community ecology and really what community ecology is all about and what this lecture is going to be all about. First and foremost, we have to first, of course, figure out what a community is. And so just like we did in our previous ecology lecture, we defined population, we consistently looked back at that definition and made sure that all of the components of that lecture fit within that population ecology definition. So what is a community? A community can be defined as the following. It is an association of populations, so already we're seeing an ecological concept here of interactions and associations. So it's an association of populations. So we have several populations here, but the key idea here is that this association is between of populations that are of different species. So this is big here, of different, S double P this time, because there are many species that we're associating with each other. So this is the association of populations of different species that live and interact, so that live and also interact, because we're studying ecology, so we have to think of those interactions in same place at the same time. Same place at same time. So, basic component of this definition we have to look at is this idea that we're looking at different species now, and we're studying the associations between those different species, all living in the same place at the same time. So of course we're broadening our scope. And in order to broaden our scope correctly, we have to study community on the ecological scale and on the ecological idea and mindset. So we're going to have to understand what it means to study community ecology, and that will be our next definition. So what is community ecology? Just like we did for population ecology, let's understand community ecology. Of course, because ecology is here, we have to immediately say that any sort of study of ecology is going to be a study of interaction. So that's first and foremost. We're always looking at interactions, living, non-living, different species now, different populations of different species are going to be interacting, and thus it is an ecological study. In addition, we have to now establish a bit of a different goal, and the goal is as follows in terms of community ecology. What is the goal of a community ecologist? The goal is simple. We have to identify patterns. So these patterns are key because they come from the environment. Identify patterns and processes that can lead to, so we'll write that down, and processes that can lead to two big things that we need to figure out. The two major goals are generalizations. So we want to get some nice generalizations based off of the associations that we see, and also plus some major differences, because look what we're doing. Go back to our definition of a community, associations of populations of different species. So we want to make some generalizations about those different species. Why are they different? And of course we want to look at the differences between them in much greater detail by understanding the patterns and the processes that they complete within their environment, the interactions that they have within each other, between each other, and between the environment as a whole. So it's a very broad study that we'll look at in much greater detail as we move forward. A big, huge component of this study is the following. It's the idea of looking at a resource. A resource is a huge idea because this is going to be a big point of interaction between different species of different populations living in the same place at the same time. Resources drive community ecology. We can define a resource as the following. A resource, you probably already have a working idea of what it is, but in ecological definition, we'll say that a resource is anything from the environment. So anything from the ENV for environment that meets the needs, so that meets the needs of a particular species. And of course, if we're talking about a particular species, we are only going to write S letter P because there's only one species in question right now. Basic idea behind resource is exactly what you think it is. Food is a resource. A nesting site, let's say, is a resource. A nesting materials are resources. Mates themselves are resources. Even hiding places. All of those things are resources. They are things from the environment, aka an interaction component, that meets the needs of a particular species. And because there's a need, there's going to be a need amongst many individuals because we're looking at different species and different populations and all of their associations in the same place, same time concept. So there's going to be what we call limiting resources. Just as a product of all these interactions working together, there are obviously going to be, of course, limiting resources that are really going to drive a lot of the study of community ecology, because these limiting resources are resources that do the following stated here, but they are actually in scarce supply, very scarce. In scarce supply or scarce supply. So they are scarce means that there's very few of them. That's why they're limiting resources. Remember that those limiting factors, the resistance that the environment poses on populations, that resistance, that idea of struggle comes up again in community ecology, and we're going to look at that in much greater detail as we move forward with this lecture. Final idea to understand about community ecology is the idea of an ecological niche. So it's called an ecological niche. And this idea was mainly proposed by a man by the name of Eugene Odum. And he came up with a classic biology, ecology quote that we always refer to when we introduce the idea of a niche. And he stated the following as a very famous quote: if the organism's habitat, so org's habitat, if organism's habitat is their address, so that's technically, we would say, their address, then the niche or niche, whatever you want to call it, the niche or niche is its profession. Is its profession. So you live in a certain place and you have a certain job within that certain place. So the habitat is the address, the niche or the niche is the profession of the organism. A very simple way of thinking of a very powerful idea in community ecology. We can further define a niche as more than just a profession. We can give it some ecological backbone to it, and we can say that it's simply going to be what I would consider the role of a species. Role of a species, and we're only focusing on one species, so one letter P, within what we would call the structure and function. The structure and function. So structure plus function always go hand in hand, of a community. So we know what a community is, and a community I'll just write as COMM. We know that this is the community, and there's going to be a role that a organism, that a species plays within that role, within the role, and there's going to be a specific structure and function of such a role. This type of ecological niche considers two major components that really are important to understand. It considers ... both the use of resources, so both the use of resources and also the interactions for those resources. So there's those resources again. Use of resources and interactions of those resources, all of which are going to contribute to the organism and its niche. Hopefully, if you get to a good niche, you will have a healthy organism, a healthy life. You will survive, and hopefully you will also reproduce because you have done these interactions and resources in a good sense, let's say. You've reached those points. So speaking of this type of reaching a profession, getting a good job, let's say, within your environment where you live, in order to get this good job, there are two main components to understand. And those go hand in hand with Eugene Odom's idea of a niche being a profession. We can state the following. An ecological niche can either be, there are two types of niche that you should understand. There's what we call a fundamental niche, and there's also what we call a realized niche, both of which are important when studying community ecology and studying these interactions and use of resources as mentioned before. A fundamental niche is what an organism can accomplish, so we'll write this down, what organism can accomplish, and it's fundamental because it's what it can accomplish under what we would consider ideal conditions. This should look familiar to a concept that we talked about in our previous population ecology lecture, the idea of R-selected species and R-selection and the ideal principles associated with exponential growth. All those things should be ringing a bell. What organism can accomplish under ideal conditions? So it's a very similar idea to what we've established before, but we're building upon it. We're saying that there's a job, and you can have an ideal job under ideal conditions to live life to the fullest. That's what I consider the fundamental niche. This organism is living life to the absolute fullest because they're getting the absolute most out of their environment. They're getting the absolute most out of their community and their interactions and resources available within that community. So this is an ideal niche, let's say. But the realized niche is what we would consider the lifestyle and resources. So lifestyle meaning, a job that's done, the interactions that are done. So lifestyle and those resources that are critical in a community, lifestyle and resources organism actually pursues. So the key word here is actually, and we're going to underline that, pursues, versus the key word being over here, ideal, and then this is actual. And then, of course, we have to ask ourselves, well, why does this happen? Why don't we see a fundamental niche all the time? Why do we see a realized niche? Well, this is because of, we'll say, due to things that we've already established. One of them right here, limiting resources. LR for limiting resources. Those are key. And because those resources are limited, because they are very scarce in their supply, there's also going to be intense competition. Those are two major driving factors of a realized niche and why we don't reach that fundamental niche all the time in every single environment and community that we see. So overall, lots of information in this introduction. Keep in mind these two major definitions because we're going to constantly be going back to them. Keep in mind the idea of a resource being a driving factor of the difference between a fundamental niche and a realized niche, and the niche simply being a profession.